So thanks to everyone who came back, especially everyone out there on the live stream. If you have questions, if you're on the live stream today, chat those questions. We've got staff here looking at your questions. We'll relay them to the speakers who are here in the room and kind of feed those in with our moderators. So we've got a little bit different pain point session we're doing today because we work with a lot of different trade organizations, and what we do and what they do really overlaps different parts of the business side and the technical side of the business. So we want to make sure that you have a chance to get feedback. There are policies you're hearing about coming through the National Association of REALTORS for your MLSs, and we're in a feedback phase. There have been proposals, you've seen them in the news, and NAR is here, CMLS is here. Obviously you as Reso folks are here to give feedback and make sure what we do gets that right, that we build in efficiency for our customers, create a competitive landscape for them. So we've got three people here who we are really excited to have. Rodney Gansho is Director of Engagement for the National Association of REALTORS and really the preeminent policy person for NAR on a national level. Jon Coile has 5 or 6 different titles, but you probably know him as Bright MLS, HomeServices of America, and he chairs a lot of the technology efforts at NAR. And TJ Bolan with Council of MLS, who you've known as a Redfin broker representative in the past. So he knows the broker side, he knows the tech side, he knows the MLS side. So let's bring them up here. This is your chance to hear what's happening, but give feedback. Today should be as interactive as you want it to be. We'll go through policy, get all your questions out of the way, give them your feedback, and then Rick Herrera from Constellation One will come up and go through the more technical side of our pain point session. So please give them a big hand.
Thank you. Is this the clicker? I take it that's the clicker? All right. Beautiful. Thank you so much. Great to be here. I'll be honest, I've attended one other Reso, and it was back when it was held in the NAR building. So this is a whole different level, guys. Well done. Well done. Rodney Gansho, Director of Engagement, National Association of REALTORS. I frame it as I'm a policy wonk. You guys are technologists, I'm a policy wonk. Great to be here. I have to check my notes. I don't recall Sam describing this as they were going to liquor you guys up before our session, and then they were going to encourage you to argue with us for any amount of time you chose to. So I think it's great. We do want to hear your feedback. The National Association is meeting in November. We're going to be considering 7 different policy proposals. I think the neat thing here is what Danae mentioned yesterday, and that is 2 of those proposals actually originated from this group. And I think that's pretty neat to see that come full circle and come back to you as a policy proposal and look for your input with regard to that proposal itself. So the plan for today is I'm going to go through the 7 recommendations. I'm not going to do a deep dive. I'm going to point to where you can get the specific language. You can look at that. If you have input or feedback that you want to direct to us after this session, feel free to reach out to myself, to Jon as chair of the MLS committee, to any representative on the MLS committee, or anyone. Rick Harris is here too as our liaison for the MLS committee and the data technology standards group as well. But we'd love to hear from you because I think your input is important. When we look at policy, we really look at it from the standpoint of practitioners and MLS executives, and how it impacts you all is important to hear and be part of that conversation as well. So like Sam said, we want your feedback, and we want to hear what you think of what's going forward in November. So if you want the deep dive and you want to see the specific language and the rationale for that, the URL's on the screen. On that URL, that page you'll find towards the fold, a section called Agendas, Reports, Recent Policy Changes, and you'll see links to the 7 recommendations. And if you want to get even geekier than that, you can get into the actual minutes from the last 2 meetings of the MLS Technology and Emerging Issues Advisory Board. Probably good to understand some of the structure of the governance at the national level. The MLS committee itself is 120 plus people. And as you can imagine, you can't do any detailed work with 120 plus people. So there is a subset of that committee called the MLS Technology and Emerging Issues Advisory Board. That group meets in advance of the national meetings. They have been meeting more regularly than that, monthly, and they do the deep dive. And you have seasoned professionals from brokers and MLS executives on that group, and it's around 20-something people. There's representatives from CMLS on the group, and we usually have someone from Reso as well providing that insight in addition. So a lot of input. And the recommendations, there's 7 of them. The first 3 that I want to get into deal with, you probably heard in the news if you're following any of this, the settlement agreement that NAR had with the Justice Department. And we're kind of in a holding pattern with regard to that. But the NAR MLS leadership, members of the advisory board, saw it important that the aspects and concerns that were raised in that agreement be pursued. So what you have to start are 3 first recommendations, deal with 3 of the 4 issues raised in that settlement agreement. And the first one is required display of listing brokers' offer of compensation to buyer's agents. It should probably say required MLS display because there's 3 components of this. If the MLS has a consumer-facing website, this policy change would require that that website include the offer to buyer brokers. If you're in a state that has transactional representation or non-agency relationships, that offer of compensation would be included as well. The second component of this policy statement is that the MLS in its data feeds to participants and subscribers will include the offer of compensation from the listing broker. And the reason they do that is the third component, which is the MLS should support the ability of participants and subscribers to display that offer of compensation either in their IDX display, VOW display, or any other distribution of the information to clients and customers. So the participants and subscribers do not have to do that, but if they choose to do that, they will have that information and that ability to do so. The next policy statement, new one that's coming about, is concerning advertising services. And there's a real change in how services are being offered in the marketplace, and this is really a result of that. The NAR Code of Ethics included Article 12, which talked about creating a true picture in your representations and promotions to the public, and this would create a bright line requirement that participants could no longer advertise their agency services as a listing broker or a buyer agent as being free or at no cost. Understanding there is because it's really not, right? That they're being paid by the listing broker, and consumers may not necessarily understand that. I'll point out that this is an MLS policy statement. There is a corresponding change to NAR's Code of Ethics that will parallel this. So we'll cover everybody who's a realtor and has the ethical obligation to do this, and then we'll cover anybody in the MLS who may not be a realtor, because we know some MLSs are opened up to non-members, or they have affiliated licensees who don't hold realtor membership. So we're covering the waterfront on this established obligation. The third policy statement concerns the prohibition of MLS participants and subscribers filtering or restricting listings displayed to consumers based on offers of compensation and brokerage. So what does that mean? Well, in IDX, we already have an ability for the listing broker to determine what information they want to push out in their IDX display. And in policy, it talks about objective basis. So if all I sell is condos, I can pull all the condos out of the IDX feed and I can display condos. If all I want to display is a particular subdivision, I can do that. Well, another objective basis up until this point has been the brokerage or the compensation. And if brokers wanted to do that, they could. This would create a prohibition of restricting the display of compensation to the public solely on the basis of, am I getting enough compensation, or am I working with brokerages that I want to work with? That would be prohibited. The next recommendation that I want to talk about concerns the MLS Standards Work Group. If you followed this at all, this is a group that was impaneled back in late 2019, pre-pandemic. We anticipated meeting and really hammering out some details in an in-person meeting in Chicago, and instead, the pandemic hit. And this group bucked up, and I put on here rigorous and remote meeting schedule because it was. This was probably the most time and the most effort put into any initiative that I've been involved in at the National Association. This group met weekly for months, for 90 minutes, and they blew up the real estate industry. The purpose of this group was to look at standards in MLS, and that can mean a million different things. And the group had trouble with that in the beginning, so they went through some exercise of blowing everything up and identifying the stakeholders in the industry, and identifying what was important to them and what services were offered by the MLS that would meet those important aspects of their business. And to you all, and also to us, it's a no-brainer, right? It's about data. They want the most accurate information, all the stakeholders, whether it's practitioners, vendors, and so on and so forth, they want the most accurate information and the most complete information. So that's where the group really focused its attention. They broke out their work product into 4 areas: compliance, data, governance, and service. And they did some pretty impressive things from 2019 to date. They recommended several changes in NAR MLS policy to address the issue of complete data, accurate data, accountability. If you're not familiar, there are some markets where MLS subscribers, participants, may see the violation of the rules as a cost of doing business if they think it advocates for their client. So we refer to those as frequent flyers. For violations of the rules, and they addressed that issue by saying you can have so many violations of the rules before you have to go before a hearing panel, and that the listing broker, the principal broker of a firm, had to be more accountable for the individuals affiliated with that firm, so the listing broker needed to attend hearings as well. And they did some other changes, but again, the focus there is the changes were really about accuracy and complete information. The other thing they did is they created a new resource at the national level, a resource for best practices. This isn't best practices like CMLS's best practices, because those are really detailed and they get into different areas. These are more high level. This is what your MLS should be thinking about if you're not already doing it. And there's a lot of MLSs that are doing that stuff, but for the ones that weren't, here's the things where you need to focus your attention. A great thing for MLS leadership to look at the beginning of their term and say, okay, what should we tick off? What are we not doing that we should be doing? And there were 6 best practices that were adopted just this past May. The other thing the group did, which will be interesting to you all, is that the group talked about sharing information and how brokers want greater access to information. The work group itself identified statewide. So you're licensed within a state. It makes sense for you to be able to get information within that state. And what should we be doing to perhaps have MLSs share information within the state so that brokers have access to it because they're licensed to do so? There are concerns related to that, right? Competency, do you know the market where you're getting the information? But that information is available outside the MLS, so shouldn't we be empowering our participants and our subscribers with that information? At least that's the thought behind it. That group has met several times. We have a facilitator helping us work through that. We hope to have some update or information available at the November meetings related to it, but just know that group's out there and it's working on that particular issue, and we hope to have an update available related to it. So why am I talking about this work group? Well, the work group is coming forward with 6 additional best practices at the November meeting. These are not mandated policies. I hear mandated policies thrown around loosely. These are best practices. These are voluntary best practices that the MLSs can adopt and take efforts to implement. So the committee, the NAR MLS committee, will consider these. There is an opportunity for these to be modified at the MLS committee level. If you all think some of the wording or the direction on this needs to be further considered or rehashed, or there's a better way to approach it, we'd love to hear from you. I know there are some in the audience that have raised or written with regard to some of these best practices, so we'd love to hear from you. We want that input. We want to make this the best it can be to help the practitioners, to help consumers. The core tenets of the MLS are efficiency, transparency, and cooperation. So however we can do that through these best practices, let's work on that together. And I'm just going to quickly go through them. The first one is discipline, that violations of the rules, it should be consistent. In some areas, it's apples to oranges, right? A violation of clear cooperation in one market is a flyer that says, why'd you do that? You shouldn't do it. And a violation in another market is a $15,000 fine. So that's completely unreasonable that there's that type of disparity in different markets. NAR, the work group, actually created a tool for sanctioning guidelines, and MLSs should be using those sanctioning guidelines to develop their sanctions for violations of the rules and regulations. The other thing is, and I'm sure this is something for a lot of you all, the work group had experience with it. I've personally had experience with it in trying to find information about requesting data feeds from MLSs. That it's sometimes a maze and you don't know who to talk to or what's available and the cost and everything else. So there should be, the standard or the best practice is there should be written instructions about requesting data feeds on the MLS's website, that anybody who wants the information, whether it's a participant, vendor working with the participant, can go to and understand how they can request information from the MLS. The next is a plan for a native Reso data dictionary compliant MLS. Let's be honest, the mandate to be Reso compliant was adopted 2016, guys. It was 5 years ago. And we're still talking about MLSs being compliant and offering their participants that information. I think there's no argument about the benefits of being Reso compliant. I think there would be a conversation about the best way to do that, but the push from the advisory board and from the work group is we can do better than we're doing right now, and we need to have a conversation about that. So the best practice is to get together, MLSs should get together with their vendor. They should come up with a written plan. They should talk about the cost involved in doing that and what it looks like. Have that hard conversation so we can get to where we need to be. Next best practice, number 4, share aggregated sales data with the state association and the National Association for advocacy purposes. Right now, NAR's research department receives information from under 200 MLSs across the country. I know in some states, the state association's unable to get information from local MLSs to help them to advocate for consumers in their market. We should be working together, MLSs and the associations of realtors, creating reports, using that information, and then leveraging that information in our particular markets. So MLSs should be sharing aggregated data with their state association and the National Association. Number 5, provide officers, directors, information about their fiduciary duty to the MLS. There's often a lot of confusion about this. If I'm a representative from a particular board, I'm serving on the MLS's board, where does my fiduciary duty lie? That needs to be explained. Individuals need to know what their role is, the importance of it, and how they should approach different actions related to the MLS itself. And last, but certainly not least, maybe the most important is the MLS should have a strategic plan. A lot of MLSs do, many MLSs don't. They need to look at what their brokers' interests and needs are. They need to address those interests and needs and come up with a plan for it. And sometimes it's not a knee-jerk reaction, it's a long-term plan, much like Reso compliance. So MLSs should be creating a strategic plan. So those are the best practices, going to go to the committee. Voluntary adoption, this will not go to the NAR Board of Directors because it's not policy, but there is an opportunity to tweak it, modify it at the committee level. So if you have insights on that, we would love to hear from you. Also, when we push this out on nar.realtor, we're looking for good examples. We're looking for any local resources that you have related to any of these best practices so that we can showcase that, we can show the great work that your MLSs are doing, and we can have other MLSs replicate that. All right, this is a big one. The next 2 recommendations deal with MLS data access and use. A conversation we've been having, right, for years. All different entities in the real estate business. I know Reso has had conversations about the NOW proposal. CMLS has had conversations about the LEAP proposal. We have wonderful acronyms, don't we? And then the brokerage firms got together and they came up with the REAL proposal. The MLS Technology and Emerging Issues Advisory Board brought in representatives from each of those groups and had them present to the advisory board. The advisory board then came up with a list of concepts with regard to data access and use, and said these are the things that we should be addressing. And the 2 that rose to the top were one source data feed, a single feed for any authorized license use of MLS information. And I've had some conversations with some of you here related to that, but that for efficiency, again, core tenants, efficiency, participants, vendors should be able to get one data feed, not multiple data feeds, for a particular participant or subscriber and their authorized uses of information. That the license agreement itself should dictate how that information is used and what information is used, not multiple data feeds, because I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that multiple data feeds somehow adds to the compliance of the situation. So one single data feed. The other one is brokerage back office feeds. A lot of MLSs offer brokerage back office feeds already, Many MLSs do not. It's a frustration for the brokerage community. It's a frustration for vendors who want to provide additional productivity tools and resources to assist clients and customers. Both these recommendations stem from the good work at the Council of Multiple Listing Services that TJ is going to talk about as far as what they've done to get that to the National Association and the efforts that they've put into it. We appreciate that input. We appreciate the collaboration that we have with CMLS. And like I said, you can get the specifics of those policies at that URL that I pointed out earlier. And then my last policy proposal deals with listing brokerage attribution. IDX VOW has been around for a long time, right? Probably 20 years, I think, now. Listing broker attribution was voluntary in the beginning of the adoption of IDX and VOW. Through the course and the evolution of internet display, online brokerage, it became a mandatory element of display. But it's just the brokerage that's mandatory. This is a proposal that enhances the current attribution to include contact information for the listing firm in IDX and VOW. A part of this also included agent attribution. That is still a discretionary element within NAR policy, so locally your MLSs can adopt that. The advisory board did not take that added step of including it in this proposal because they think that discretionary ability is already there. We'll see. I've heard some talk that there's going to be reconsideration of that and a request that the committee expanded to include listing agent as well. But that's the 7 recommendations. Hopefully you found it as invigorating as I have. Was that good, John? Was that good? That was good? It could not be better than the mimosas. So what we're going to do is bring TJ up. He's going to talk about everything that CMLS did to bring those 2 recommendations, proposals to NAR for consideration. Then we'll bring John up as the chair of NAR's MLS committee to kind of talk about next steps and also the broker perspective of everything that's going on. So I thank you all for your time, and I'll turn it over to TJ.
Thank you, Rodney. I hope everyone's still awake. I hope the mimosas were good. I haven't had a chance to try one out yet. Waiting to have a celebratory mimosa after this, I hope. So my name is TJ. I've been with the Council of Multiple Listing Services for almost exactly 1 month. So I'm glad I'm here to tell you exactly what we've been working on for the last year. Prior to my work at CMLS, I worked for Redfin for nearly 5 years in expansion and MLS compliance. And in my past life, I worked for Northwest Multiple Listing Service in Seattle in a ton of different capacities. I think at the end I was in the membership department and marketing and a few other things as well. So to talk about policy statements 8.6 and 8.7, it really is full circle, which is what Rodney spoke about initially. I've been a part of these discussions at Reso for a few years now, and pain point sessions, we get so much fantastic information coming out of these pain point sessions. It's always such an interesting discussion to be a part of, and these 2 ideas for a single data feed and for a broker back office feed to be NAR policy are ideas that came from these broker pain point sessions. So we really are full circle today, being able to get up on stage here and tell you about the 2 policies that we have going for the recommendations at the NAR conference in just like 2-3 weeks. It's coming up pretty soon. So the first one for a single data feed, I think that it kind of speaks for itself, and I've been discussing that policy with quite a few of you this week. It's really exciting for a lot of practitioners out there, people that ingest the data feeds, because it really simplifies things so much. And that was the goal of the policy. So at CMLS, we have the Data Access and Concepts Work Group. It's made up of 50 or 60 individuals from across the industry. They all got together and said, what's the best way that we can do to elevate the MLS industry and get everybody onto the same level playing field so that everyone has the same access to data that makes it easier to access that data for brokerages, for vendors to distribute it, and for MLSs to provide those services. And really the main thing was one single data feed. It's something that I wish I had from a lot more MLSs back in my Redfin days, but we're getting here now, which is really exciting. It really was a grassroots effort for us to bring together these policies. After the broker pain point sessions, we put together several surveys that went out to CMLS members, to brokerages, to other MLSs, to vendors, to see what a lot of the hot topics were that we needed to start reviewing for some NAR policy recommendations. So after we got a ton of information together, that's when our data access group really got to work and dug in and figured out the best way to do that. What was exciting too for me on the single data feed policy is it actually came down to a one-sentence policy, which is probably one of the rarest things I've ever seen in my experience in the industry. It's so simple. I definitely recommend, like Rodney said, to go onto the site and take a look at the meeting minutes. Sounds boring. They're actually really great. I love checking all that stuff out, but I'm a nerd. The other policy I want to talk about is 8.7, which is the broker back office feed. Like Rodney mentioned again, quite a few MLSs offer this type of a feed, but there are some that don't. And it's something that a lot of brokerages, a lot of service providers need to offer to their agents, their members. It's something that's really important to power a lot of those back office tools and systems. So again, we're just trying to elevate the services that are provided nationwide by the MLS industry and bring everybody up onto that same level playing field. We're trying to raise the floor, not lower the ceiling or create a ceiling. And that's really the long and short of it. Does anyone have any questions about those policies that I can attempt to answer this morning? Wow. All right. Mimosas are working. Fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm going to bring up Jon here to talk about some more policy. Thank you.
Sam had us all scared. He told us that you guys would be full of piss and vinegar and just start winging stuff at us. So I'll try and warm you up a little bit more. Want to tell you about first off, Jon Coile. I'm a VP of MLS and Industry Relations for HomeServices. I used to run a regional company for HomeServices, and we folded it into Long & Foster. And so then I went looking for something to do, and that's what I get to do is MLS policy and hang out with these guys, and it's been a lot of fun. I'm the chair of the MLS Policy Committee this year. I'm on the Emerging Issues Advisory Board, which comes mandatory when you're chair of the committee. And then also on the PAG for statewide data share and co-chair of the MLS Standards Work Group, which has come up with these best practices rather than standards. Now just wasn't the right time with zillions of lawsuits going on and DOJ and everything else. So we decided let's just make it best practices. And as you know, being in the business, sometimes best practices over years evolve into standards mandatory. So we'll see where they end up. Let me tell you what happens from here. What happens from here is we're trying to collect information from people, get feedback on these policies, and I just want to say really your feedback needs to be in writing to Rodney, because you can tell me and then I can go and say it and it doesn't have any weight. They want to see it in writing from you, get it to Rodney, and then he gets it out to the whole committee. 120 people plus on the committee. We meet twice a year for roughly 90 minutes. You can see we have to go through all of these policies and pass them and wordsmith them, and they will go up on the screen. The one feed policy, 20 words, took us 2.5 hours on the advisory board to get the right words in the right order with the right Oxford commas in the right spot. So that all will be replicated in San Diego. So if you have feedback on that, get it in writing to Rodney, and it will be read by the committee and it will be taken into consideration. So what happens in San Diego is everything goes to the committee votes. Whatever they vote to pass goes forward to the executive committee of NAR, which is about 90 people, and it'll get presented there, and they'll consider it, and then they'll vote to recommend approval, recommend sending it back to the committee, or recommending turning it down. Those are not binding recommendations. That then goes to the 800+ member board of directors of NAR, and they get to vote on it. There people can line up, only directors can line up at the microphones in that meeting and talk for or against the proposal, and then it gets voted on. So most things pass when they get all the way through all the hurdles to the board of directors, but not everything. So now's your time, if you have input on any of these things, is to get it in now. So I noticed a few of you had your phones out. Oops, I'm going to need to back up all the way to the beginning, and you wanted to get the link that Rodney had up there, so maybe we'll see if in the back they can put that back up there so you can take a picture of that. But it's all on the hub also, so if you're familiar with that or have access to that.
Yeah, another option for you is just go to nar.realtor, and if you do a search on MLS policy, that page will come up.
Yeah.
There you
Or
go.
take a picture. There you go, John. So any questions for me? Because then I have a question for you. So my question for you is, go ahead.
Hi. Is this thing on? All right. Rebecca Jensen, CEO of MRED. Thank you so much for being here at the Reso conference. It's great to see you. And I think that you answered in part some of the questions as far as like how to submit feedback. I did have a chance to run some of these items through the MRED board of managers and some of our brokerages there. And so first of all, I thought that there were going to be more rules related to buyer-broker agreements and commingling, but I didn't see those in the presentation today. So those aren't happening. Okay. So that's awesome. And it also comes into the discussion that we had about whether or not some of these policies have been run through the NAR Professional Standards Committee, because I think that, at least the feedback that I heard was that that might be conflicting, and a couple of the different issues might be related to things that weren't discussed today as far as like commingling. So that's not part of it.
That got parked.
Wonderful.
We have 90 minutes to get all of that stuff through.
Okay.
Everything will go up on the screen. Every word will get talked about in San Diego. So there are a lot of other things. So stand by for next year. It's going to be
Thank
exciting,
you.
but that's not
a
there.
huge
And
relief.
I'll add too, but there sometimes is a lot of overlap between MLS and professional standards, or MLS tries to get in a lane that maybe they shouldn't be getting in. I've heard some criticism of some of the stuff here that maybe it's strictly professional standards issue and shouldn't delve into this. And in particular, the whole offering services as free or at no cost. So it wasn't contrary. Standard of Practice 12.1 had some different language that talked about if you're gonna, you have to explain the terms and conditions of that. To eliminate any confusion or any perceived inconsistency between that, the language that's being adopted as the MLS policy statement is the same language that will now be reflected in the NAR Code of Ethics under Standard of Practice 12.1. So if somebody says that, point out to them, yes, it's being addressed in both houses. And the reason it's being addressed in MLS is, again, when I mentioned, you do have participants who aren't realtors. You do have licensees who aren't realtors. They're not obligated to that standard of ethical behavior. And for these issues, these are important issues. And we need to make sure that everybody's kind of operating from that same level playing field when it comes to that.
Let me also
Thank you,
say,
Rebecca.
read every word that's in there and don't put in words from your head into the sentence that aren't there. So can you advertise free CMA? Yes, you can advertise free CMA. It doesn't say you can't you can't say, hey, buyer agency is free because it's paid by the seller through the listing broker, but it's free to you. Their DOJ goes nuts on that, so it doesn't say that. But can you do free CMA? Absolutely. So people have been saying that, tell them to sit
So
down,
I think
relax.
that is exactly right? Free CMA, free advice on you should get rid of the couch or paint this wall or whatnot,
Read the
right?
policy.
So is that going to be in the FAQs that are released then?
Any
so
support
that
materials that we provide and helps
Awesome.
provide clarity, we will.
As
we have
usual,
a new
you've
staff
thought of it.
person at NAR that's his central focus is resources and providing support materials. So you'll see
So
more
is
of
that
that
available
coming from.
through that link that you were thank you for putting that back up. Will that be something that I can like forward on? Yes, that one.
So if you go there, you'll get the list of recommendations. Once it moves through the governance process and becomes policy, then yeah, we'll create resources related
Okay.
to it.
So no FAQ until it's voted on policy. So you just have to tell them, read the words, don't put in words that aren't in there.
I will try to repeat that.
The other
Thank you
thing
so
I'd point out too is there were 2 recent committee meetings of the advisory board. 6 of the recommendations were adopted at the September 9th and 10th. It was an in-person meeting in Chicago, first one in years, just like being here. It was awesome, right, to see people again. But there was then another meeting on October 5th. We have monthly meetings. The October 5th meeting, the recommendations from September 9th and 10th for the one data feed and the back office were tweaked slightly. So if you have, make sure when you look at those that you're pulling the latest version of the 7 recommendations. If you have the piece that has 6 recommendations, you're not operating from the most recent up-to-date language. So just make note of that.
And let me tell you how that happened. It came out of this room. That somebody had a change, and they put it in writing and sent it to Rodney and to me, and then it went through legal, and they looked at it and they tweaked it, and on the first policy, the 20 words, it took us 2.5 hours, they added an S, so it's for all permitted uses, not for all permitted use. So that was in there, and then there were some other changes that they requested, and they got half of them in the second part, so.
Well, thank you for being so thorough. And again, thanks for being here. It's good to see you.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thanks.
Appreciate the comments.
Good morning, Michelle Walker from Maris MLS. So the requirement to share the data with the state associations and NAR, how does that balance with individual states' non-disclosure laws?
So again, that's part of the best practices, so it's not a requirement, right? Let's make sure we all walk out of here with the same understanding. The best practices are voluntary adoption. These are things your MLSs can look at. And as far as disclosure laws, aggregated data. So if you want to leave out the sales price, you can leave out the sales price. You can provide the other information that will help your state and the National Association in analyzing that data and coming up with reports and analytics related to it. So
Wonderful.
you only have to give what you want to give. And give.
But it's also aggregated data, not specific about 123 Sycamore Street.
Hey, Rodney and panel, thanks for being here today. Just from a tactical standpoint, what would be helpful for us as MLS directors is to have this in one document instead of having to dig through the documents. That would be really helpful to just have, because we all have boards that we have to share these with, and then we all have to translate them into our own format, and then something gets lost or something like that. Because I have like 10 different people that vote in my state on these policies, so that would be super helpful.
So the document that we pointed you to, the 7 recommendations, that's the most concise, like.
Then you have to go to the minutes and see what.
No, you don't have to go to the minutes. Everything you need
It's pulled forward.
is in the recommendation list. You have the specific motion, you have the language of the recommendation, and you have the rationale. If you're looking to give somebody a nice aggregated, concise piece that explains what the committee's considering, that's the piece you want to use. The minutes are just for the geeks who want to get in there and kind of delve into it. Sam told me you were all geeks, so I didn't realize it was just technology geeks. I'm a policy geek. I'm learning about technology too. I think I heard tokenizing the United States. That's a whole new one to me, so thank you for that, guys.
Policy geeks are here too.
Thank you. Debbie Way with Canopy MLS. One of the things that I think I've heard concerns about the one data feed is that there might be a misconception that if you take an example of, let's say, ABC Realty has an IDX data feed, like with Constellation for their IDX website, and then maybe they have a VOW data feed going to IDC Global, and then like a broker back office data feed set up with Lone Wolf or something like that. It's not that there's just one data feed and they're sharing it with all 3 of those different entities, because you would still have separate data feeds with those different entities, but it's but like if a brokerage were doing everything in-house, or maybe they were doing different services with one particular vendor, at that point there would be one data feed. But I've heard like some misconception out there that I think there's people think that it's one data feed and it's going to be shared.
Thanks, Debbie.
different-
And that's so important, right? We're not talking about giving information to groups or entities that's information they can't use. We're talking about creating efficiencies. So if you have an in-house tech company or in-house tech within a brokerage, yeah, they would get one data feed of all the information they need, and they're authorized to use all of that information. But if you have a broker who's working with an entity that's doing his IDX, the only information you'd have to give him is the IDX information. If he's working with a brokerage that's doing more than IDX, well, then give him one data feed of all the information and let the license agreement dictate how they use that information and what information they can use.
And I want to mention too, we're putting together an implementation guide at CMLS as well. So we're starting to work on that now. That'll be going out to all the MLSs, so you have some information and a guide to help you kind of through any changes you have to make to your policy or anything else. So it should help a little bit.
And if you talk to Ninvi Adams, she's still here, or she won an award, so she left. But at New York, they've done something with their data license agreement. So they have like a master data license agreement, and then they have a pick list. Are you going to use it for IDX? Check here, and it adds that addendum. Are you going to use it for value? Add this. So they've already, in effect, built their license to plug into a concept of a single data feed, and so it's one data feed, multiple uses. So there's a different license for each use.
Al McKelman with CoreLogic. Just want to get a little bit of clarity around the recommendation around native compliance. Does that mean in the actual database, or is that more a matter of listing input forms and where the data is coming from?
I was waiting for this question. When you talk about translated data, the frustration that we're hearing is that there's errors in that. That the argument is the best way to comply with Reso is to have that at the ground level. So you guys tell me, I think everybody agrees that having a native compliant access to Reso compliant data is the best way for vendors and brokers to get that information. That's what we're trying to accomplish, right? If it's and I know Sam talked to me about this, and again, I'm not a technologist, I'm a policy geek. But if you're talking about the MLS and then layering some technology on it to provide Reso compliant data, dictionary compliant data to vendors and to vendors and the brokerage, that meets the requirement, right, of the standard. You're providing Reso compliant data. We could use some help in this area to understand how we move the industry forward. It just seems that after 5 years plus, we should be a little further ahead than we are right now. And I think I don't know if it's pulling some others along, with some people pulling us forward, but we need to have the conversation, and we need to figure out how to get all the MLSs in a position where they're providing Reso compliant, Web API, data dictionary compliant data to vendors and participants.
So I would say kind of my interpretation of that is the recommendation is that you're not really using aggregation for certification. You should be certified at the source. And I think a lot of the mincing of words comes around native because people use that in different ways, but it's really the source is what you're recommending should be.
The database.
Oh, they can't hear? The mic's here? So what Al was saying for you back home, hi everybody back home, is that Al said it should be the source. That the source of the information should be Reso compliant. Now, you can parse that a lot of different ways too. Now, TJ said database. Some people may not agree with database, that it's really whatever comes out of the MLS and provided to brokers. So I think there's a conversation to be had about that. The thing is, we need to have the conversation, right? And in a lot of MLSs right now, they're not having that conversation with their vendors, and they need to.
And we should point out, by the way, this is kind of cool because we can put words in Al's mouth because
And Al
nobody
said-
else can hear him
Al
online.
said, God, you guys are smart. Good looking.
And handsome too. No, we should point out that this is going forward as a best practice recommendation that you sit down and talk by next July. So, I mean, it's just next it's going to be a pretty please best practice. I mean, I don't know how much softer we can make it, but it's 2016. It became mandatory, and we're still not even sitting down talking about it. So best practice to at least figure out what you're doing. And you got 8 months to do that, and then all you have to do is figure out what you're doing, and that's frankly just a best practice.
And the other thing in my comments, right, is we're going to put these best practices out there, and then we want some local examples. We want some support materials. And the vendor community, if you guys have ways that you think, and here's the way you can do it, here's a great way to do it, share that information with us. We'll put that online. We'll make sure that the MLS industry, the MLS community understands, and here's a way to do it. We just need to move that ball forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Al.
Cindy Miller with Netris. To go back to Debbie Way's comments, I think the confusion comes in, Rodney, in the language. and it's used elsewhere in NAR language, that the single broker data feed is to the participant or their designee. And so NAR uses that elsewhere. The designee is somebody within the brokerage firm. That is not referring to a third-party vendor. And I think some people interpret that it could be a third-party vendor, and so one data feed, shared across different vendors for that single broker. So can you clarify the definition of what you mean by designee?
So thank you. For those at home, the question's about the term designee within the single data feed. I can tell you designees, as it's applied to the listing broker data feed, because that's really where that language came from, which was what the policy adopted last year that said listing brokers have a right to get a data feed of all of their listing information, any historical information, and they can provide that information to their designee, and they can use that information however they see fit. Designee is not limited. It can be a vendor, it can be anybody. Debbie's point, I thought, was, does that mean that if I have a right to IDX information, VOW information, listing brokers information, that I have to give that information to every designee that a participant is working with? And I think the response, the response is that if you're talking about a vendor who's only doing IDX, then that's all they have a right to get. If you're talking about a vendor who's only doing VOW, they have a right to get the VOW information. Right. We're not opening it up and giving everybody information that they have no use for.
Correct. It's still different streams for different vendors, not
correct. But
all
if you're
your
using a vendor that's doing
yeah.
more than one thing for you,
right.
then it's one stream to that vendor for the efficiency.
Okay, thanks.
I wanted to comment on with regards to the native statement. So I made that in a proposal for the data dictionary in 2011, and the interpretation really hasn't changed. You don't want to try to dictate the database. The reason why you have technologists come forward and say, hey, wait a minute, because how they're normalizing, how they have their own standard underneath, and it's built to support different things. One of those is to conduct the data. So I think for your purposes, your net effect is if you have that native at the listing input form, that will give you the net effect. Because where you're having problems is when the translation gets overly complex, when things become incompatible, right? So that's my recommendation to you, and it's pretty simple. Just put it up at the input form and leave it at that, and that way the technologists here can do what they need to do without having any kind of policy push on them, and it will solve that problem.
And I see people shaking their heads. Does everybody agree with what he just said, or do you guys have a different take on it? All right, thank you very much for that. I see thumbs up. That's good. The mimosas are kicking in. Look out.
I think that sometimes can be true, but not always. If the input form is native and it matches dictionary, I think that's great. But the use case that we received in Data Consumer Group is, hey, I'm trying to build an application. I want it to look and feel like what the agents are used to. And if that is not native Reso Data Dictionary, that's a problem. Usually that input form goes direct into the database. If the database isn't compliant, then this isn't going to be compliant. And so therefore you run into a conflict there. What you're saying can be true, but isn't necessarily true either. Yeah.
So for everybody back home, they're getting right in each other's face. It's getting really
We're
exciting.
We're actually on the same
Not
page.
going to blows yet, but they don't agree with one another, which is exactly what we're looking for.
We are on the same page. It's kind of what you see in the user interface is where you want to set the policy. Because the problem is people see one thing inside the MLS and see it worded a different way in another system. That's kind of one base issue. And the other is those complex mappings that I mentioned. So
thank you for the comment. We need help in this area, so anything we can do to help explain for the people out in the field who are doing this, let us know what we can do to do that.
I think I'm on the same page. It's a non-geek comment. In our MLS system, it's for Al, wherever he went. In our MLS system, we have statuses, and those statuses are being pumped out to a couple places via RET, But then we also feed our data to the grid where it's getting normalized to the Reso standard, and some other statuses come out. And those two statuses aren't compatible. If we fixed our back end, our database to be compliant, then everybody would be happy. I think what Rob said, as long as what everyone sees is the same, we're good. And one more comment I just want to make. I'm on the work group, and Debbie from Canopy is on the advisory board, and John and Rodney, you guys rock. You guys have done
Thank you very much for
fantastic
that. I
job.
appreciate that.
You need to repeat
For
that
everybody
one.
back home, they're clapping for John, myself, and I'm sure they meant TJ in that as well.
All right, guys. You wanted people to throw tomatoes at you. The online people are definitely throwing tomatoes at you.
And that wraps up our session. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm sorry, but all right, online.
So I'm going to have to come up here probably a couple times to ask questions. We've got one that is, do we feel like offering a translated data set to meet the NAR mandate is complying to the spirit of the mandate?
I would say it's compliant with the spirit.
Remember to repeat the question.
I need to repeat the question. What was the question? Do we feel that translated information from the data set is compliant with the spirit of the requirement? Is that good? Did I do all right? I don't see head shakes. I got a shoulder shrug. Yes, I think it meets the spirit and intent of it, but the problem is that we're hearing, what the committee heard, is there's a lot of frustration still by brokers and vendors that the information they're getting is not Reso compliant. That's what it boils down to. If it was all Reso compliant, however it was being spit out to the vendors and the brokers, we wouldn't even be talking about this, guys. So the point is to try and get to that place. Oh, here comes Mike. Here we go.
Yeah, and I'll write an email, Rodney, to try and address some of this. But I mean, I think this. I mean, it's just a best practice, so I guess we could, ignore it. But I think John was pretty clear that you want it to be a mandate eventually. So when you're getting to something as important as this, there shouldn't be all this uncertainty about what you really mean. The language should be clear, and it is not clear. Many people are interpreting these words in different ways, and I think that it's just too important. You're asking the industry to convert their databases to something new. That's 500 plus MLS conversions. This is millions and millions and millions of dollars that you're talking about. Years of effort that you're talking about. Let's do it if that's what's going to happen, but you better be clear about what you're doing. I am super skeptical that CRMLS is going to change their statuses to those standard statuses. I can't imagine Bright is going to change their statuses to those standard statuses. So either the dictionary has to change to accommodate the local statuses that they have, or they're going to have to buckle under. I don't see any of that happening. So you can talk about the desire of this, and I agree there's desirability there, but that's a huge undertaking that you're asking for. Maybe. I wrote a blog post about it, and Sam said, no, that's not what we're talking about. Nobody's talking about converting a database. Now everybody gets up and says, we're talking about converting the database. That shouldn't be a question. Like, we shouldn't have to interpret this and wonder what it means, but it's just not clear. So you're asking for help or input. I would love to come to that meeting and talk about that language, because it isn't that hard to be specific, but it's really not clear. It's just not clear to anybody what you actually mean, what you're actually trying to require of vendors and MLSs. I have plenty of our customers calling and saying, do we have to convert our whole system? I'm like, it sounds like it, but then Sam says it doesn't. And now you're saying it does?
I don't think I said convert the database. I think I danced around it as much as others.
So they don't have to convert.
I didn't say that either. I said we should have. Wait, how you like that? And I'm not even an attorney. We need to provide our brokers and our vendors Reso compliant data. And I think the sentiment in the industry is, if it was a database compliant, Reso compliant database, that would be a preferable way to approach it. But in the end, we simply want Reso compliant data to get in the hands of vendors and brokers.
You already have that vehicle. No new policy is necessary, right, to that direct problem. No new policy is necessary.
That's not what we're hearing.
Now,
in the
what
field.
native means,
Yeah, but people aren't complying.
right, but they're not compliant.
They're not complying.
So you're going to come up with another policy because,
No, we come up with a
But
best
let me-
practice for you to sit down and figure out why you're not complying and start thinking about it.
I came up with the best practice and I executed it. All right.
I get it.
So,
We also looked at
but
pulling charters
you
and
gotta,
how do we
what
get
Mike, what
enforcement?
Mike is, hold on, what Mike is referring to is that execution. I did have standard status, changed it completely. It's a big deal. I spent years making a lot of changes. I had, luckily, very willing committees, and there's cost. There's a lot of cost. So the notion of making it native, there's two parts. One, don't say database. The technologists in the room will reject it, right? Say input form. I'm telling you, just any of the technologists here, do you want your back end dictated structure-wise? It'll all be no, 100%. So just stay away from that term. Talk listing input form, right? I think that's a good way to simplify it. But still, changing your listing input form will result in many systems having to go through a full system conversion, not just changing their databases. When you change the database in an MLS enough, the vendor doesn't just tweak the fields. They build a whole new system and convert you over. You have data loss, you have all those things that happen with conversion. So, a best practice, I completely agree. That's why I was all about certifying the pass off the data, the problem that you're getting feedback on, that needs to be followed up on directly. You're not going to solve it by mandating native in the MLS systems because it's not going to happen for a very long time. You need to focus on the real problem, which is we've got our certification engine. Start talking about what you want those results to be, right? That's where the failing's happening, and it's all popping up in that certification, right? So look at that output and talk about it from that level. And then keep plugging native because I believe in it.
This is exactly why they're here. So you're not watching a live stream of NAR when a committee's voting on something and the technologists, the engineers have not weighed in. It's why they're here. It's why it's a best practice. Maybe it's not the right best practice. We know what folks asked us for. That's why those committees worked on these things. But we need the technologists to weigh in. Thank God it's just a best practice right now because we're getting some interesting arguments here. But this is beautiful. This is what we're supposed to do on the last day here, right? What else? Who else has got input here? Rick's going to talk a lot when we get into a little more technical side from Constellation. So we'll hear some interesting arguments. He's just sitting here just holding back right now. Rick.
Well, I'm not going to talk about technology. I am the official bouncer. So if you want to chase me out of the room, I want to take a different question than the nativeness and so on. So I'm a broker, and you're having one of the rules that says I can't sort the database based on a company or a compensation model, okay? And I get why, because it's my relationship with the consumer that I'm required to show them everything that meets their criteria, and if it's got a compensation field, I should be talking about compensation. Those are ethical issues, but also have to be in the MLS for those non-realtor members. On the flip side, as a broker, two ideas. I get a call from a client and they said, I don't know exactly where I was, but I saw this really cool house and I saw a blue and white sign with a red and yellow balloon on it. Find that listing for me. And as a broker in my marketplace, I know that white and blue and yellow and brown mean this company. So I go search for that company. So I'm looking for the technologist to say to me, how do I both not allow the search when I'm trying to provide information to the client, but at the same time allow me to do my job, which is to track down that individual listing by that individual broker. So that's one. The secondary side of it, I'm a broker who is in expansion mode and I'm looking for individual agents that have a certain production. So I want to search on production numbers. I want to search on if somebody is really good at negotiating their commission, and they might be good for my company because they keep the bottom line up, I might like to search on that particular field. Not for the consumer, but for me on the inside. How do I do that? So, because what I will say to you is we don't have a licensing agreement for what realtors say, and I are one. So if you say to me, well, it's my job not to do that, you're not helping me not do that. Where at the same time, we have a very specific rule that says, I can't do it this particular way. What can the technologist do to help me with that problem? Help me with compliance. Or is it simply too hard a nut to crack? And I'm having a mimosa now.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. You used a specific term, though, that I want to point something out because there was a question that was raised, and that's about sorting. The question that came to us is, okay, well, this policy about not being able to restrict or filter listings based on compensation and brokerage, does that mean that a brokerage couldn't, or an MLS couldn't provide all of the properties and sort it based on compensation and brokerage? That's still allowed because it's there, right? And remember, the policy statement and the prohibition here is about the information you provide to consumers, that you can't prohibit or you can't filter and you can't restrict access to properties just because the broker's determined that he doesn't like the level of compensation or he doesn't like a particular brokerage. We want to make sure that the public is getting all the properties that satisfy and meet their needs, and the interests of the broker are secondary. The code already calls for that, but the industry is such that we need to establish a policy recognizing this as well.
So going back to what I said earlier about don't insert words or delete words, it says that you can't, it's in the display. So you can't do a save search that shows everything except this discount broker who has low co-op commissions that you don't want to. You can't do that anymore. You can't basically drive a search that way for display. But can you show one listing? Certainly. Can you search for those agents you wanted to recruit and do metrics on them? Absolutely. It's just on automated display.
So as a follow-on for display, and I'm part of the work group, we had a lot of discussion about it. And my initial piece was, well, you know, when I do my customer printout, well, that's not the only form of display. So as an example, when I create a portal, which is another form of display, am I then required, and can the technologist help me with that, by putting the compensation field in that portal display? Or when I have a printout, if I'm using paper, or on a mobile display, where the compensation is there. So it's a different way to think about that confidential field that has been in the IDX payload, and maybe that's a piece that we could consider talking about or implementing or thinking about as a group.
And we're going to transfer over to the tech implementation here shortly, which Rick Herrera is going to lead for us from Constellation One. Rodney, you're not going to get away. I know people are going to keep asking this, but if we can focus on policy and then we'll transition to tech. We promised these guys they would get a mimosa before they were out of here as well. So, but keep going for now. This is great.
That's the long, good segue. Rather than talking about search or safe search, I think NAR is much better at speaking policy about practice and allow the technology to find the solution for it, right? Remember when IDX started working on voice? Yep. IDX should just really be talking about reciprocity and how, if you're going to show somebody else's listings, what the rules are, because the technology is always going to be changing. Same thing around this search. It's perfectly valid to search by compensation, especially you're on the sell side and you're doing research, right? There's nothing wrong with that. So when we start saying, you know, restrictions, what we're really, I think, saying is that you can't filter listings from a buyer based on compensation, right? Rather than saying it's a safe search, because safe searches get used for things other than just showing it to a consumer. I think maybe if you guys raise the level up terminology-wise a little bit, it'll make it more long-lasting as well.
Excellent point. And if you look at a lot of the policies, they're they're not pages and pages long. Part of it is it's hard to get it through the committee if it's pages and pages long, but also there allows for some of that interpretation. So go look at the words and see if you're comfortable with the words of the policy. Well, we don't talk about saved searches in there. We just talk about that for display to the consumer you can't do. Okay, good. We appreciate it. So, and just final point on that, when you give feedback to the committee, recognize that the committee of 120, they're going to have a read ahead of 7,500 pages. So if you write like an 8-page feedback, single-spaced, it's not going to have as much impact as if you can be pithy and just get to your point.
So maybe 6 pages?
Yeah, 6.
All technical jargon, too, really goes over good.
So I'm going to hit on a few points that have been discussed. First of all, as a data consumer, I'm with Tribus. We focus on medium and large brokerages as a vendor, and we handle back office feeds. We handle their website. We handle everything. We go back and get data going back 20 years of their transaction data to produce reporting for them. And with that, I can tell you not one of my brokers cares what the database field names are. I have a hard enough time explaining the data dictionary consuming names are. So as you know, speaking on behalf of us and our clients, I don't think anybody needs to change their database itself. But I think my main point is overall, we need to focus on getting the policy right. And I think this is exactly what Rob was just saying, is as a former chair of the Business Issues Committee at NAR, I think the people that are there want to get it right. Yes, they have 500 pages to read. Yes, directors have a lot to deal with. But the problem is so many times unintended consequences or things get left out and then it leads to ambiguity. And why I actually came up here, the original point is to talk about photos for just a second. So in the one feed concept and in last year before when we had MyIDX and being able to get all of your own data out, a perfect example of this is we said you can get your data out. Well, that's an ambiguous term. And I can tell you a lot of MLSs don't understand what that means. And so because it wasn't specifically said, they say, oh, you can get the data out that you put in, but that doesn't include photos. And so that was my main point that I walked up here is, you should, if you put something in, a raw data, if the policy says your data out, I see that as photos. A lot of MLSs say that doesn't include photos, and then the only photo they give you back is the watermarked, dumbed down, highly compressed photo. Being in the business where we do print marketing and other pieces of marketing for our clients as well, they want that high-res photo. And so I think the overall concept is take a moment, get the policy right, don't be too reactive, because then what happens is Mike Wurtzer has to go down to however many MLSs FBS has, and CoreLogic goes to their MLSs, and then everybody starts scrambling to follow the policy, and then, oh, wait a minute, we didn't think about this, or we didn't think about that, and now we spend the next year, because it takes that long to get something back in front of the committee to work on it.
Okay, excellent point. Thank you for that. And I have a question for this room based on that. So there's the Realty Alliance you're probably familiar with, is like 75 of the largest brokers. And then there's an offshoot that's called the Broker Resource Network, BRN, which includes pretty much most of the Realty Alliance plus a lot of other brokers and brokers who didn't want to join or couldn't join Realty Alliance. That group has put forward a request that that NAR make it mandatory for MLSs to be able to provide unwatermarked high-res photos back to in the PDAP feed, and so that came forward to the Emerging Issues Advisory Board in September, so it got punted to next year because we didn't have enough information. We didn't know, is that going to be a tremendous burden? Are you ingesting those photos and dumbing them down and watermarking them right then and don't keep the high res? Do you have enough bandwidth to store high res photos in the format they're submitted so that you can serve them back without the watermark for exactly the point you made that they want to do it in print? So we need feedback. And so that's sort of how the advisory board works. We knew that we were way out in front of our skis on that one. We didn't know the technical details, and so we just said, let's push that out until we can get feedback from Reso, from CMLS, from the people who would actually, and the vendors who would actually have to facilitate that. So.
And let me add to Rob, your comment, and to the gentleman who just spoke, the accuracy of the language in the policy, that's what they strive for. So I'm not saying that they're perfect, right? I'd love to tell you they are. But that's why we're listening to you all. That's why we're getting this feedback. There are considerations from the tech side that maybe aren't reflected in the policy. And the other thing to the comment that was just raised, the whole other part of this is enforcement and application and interpretation. And sometimes MLSs don't get it right. So we all need to work together, right? To go where we want to go, get the policy as best as we can get it, and make sure that everybody's consistent in applying that. So I appreciate the comments.
And we're going to we can keep asking these same questions, talking about the same topics, but I have to let these guys off the hook. They'll probably still be here. We're going to take notes on all of this and get it directly to the committee. Okay, last policy question, but actually not the last one, just the last one they have to receive on stage. And then we're going to bring up Rick and get going in. A little more technical, but give us the policy. They're here. They flew to Kiowa Island for this, so you can keep going. Go ahead, Greg.
Thank you. Just because this is the policy we didn't address here, maybe less applicable to this room, maybe not, but just talking about the attribution policy, because you all are here, because my esteemed colleagues and MLS directors are here, I feel like it's a great forum to talk about it because you all will be discussing it in a few weeks. I've just had some huge concerns listening to the debate of the policy, and that makes me concerned about the policy itself, mostly stemming from both sides of this issue you can take. One side being, the buy side, solutions that are out there are standing up lesser competitors, things of this nature I've heard in discussions from major brokerage leaders as they discuss this policy, which I just think is absolutely nuts and crazy. We absolutely want to provide so many technology tools to our agents who provide services to anybody, their friends and neighbors who look at 50 houses represented by our colleagues in the market. On the other end, there are other people arguing, that the listing display attribution results in dual agency, which is just also equally as insane as it's being debated, because of course listing brokers can receive information from consumers. They are totally qualified to answer questions about listings they have on the market. I just am super concerned with the debate. I think the debate has taken me to a place where I want to violently oppose the policy just based on opening arguments, based on the discussions. It should be as simple as, of course, a listing brokerage should have equal attribution on a listing. They've generated the listing. They have the agreement with the client. So I just wanted to use this forum to break those couple of points open. I appreciate everybody's work on it. I don't participate on the committees, so this was my 2 minutes to add some insight, and I will write. I've already drafted some comments that I have, and I will write to you and make sure you get it, but I just wanted to use this moment to talk about the policy we hadn't yet.
So actually, I'm going to ask you to keep going for a second, but let me just say, at CMLS, it was really interesting hearing all the MLS directors talking about the consumer and what does the consumer want, what does the consumer need. And I think when a consumer is on a website and then they see that it's 123 Sycamore and it's from RE/MAX, they can jump off, go to Google, put in 123 Sycamore RE/MAX, find the listing agent right away. Why are we making them jump through those hoops to find the listing broker, the listing agent? The second thing is that there was a slide up yesterday that showed that like 56% of all listings are social media, and you get down to IDX and it's like 8%. And we've seen the big portals pivot their models because the leads just whatever. So it seems like maybe we would be fighting over something that doesn't really matter in a lot of cases, but when it does matter, what's the consumer, what's best in the best interest of consumers? And I think overall, from a national perspective, we're looking at either we get ahead of doing what's right for the consumer, or somebody, DOJ, is going to push us in that direction. So it's maybe better if we get a little bit ahead of it. So that's kind of an underlying thought on that. But you said that you were feeling, having heard arguments, that you're really adamantly against it. And I wonder if you could just go a little bit deeper on why adamantly.
Sure.
against
Well,
it.
what's better for the consumer is debatable. I think that's an easy thing to say that we're striving for, and I think anybody in this business will have that as a, number one on their mission statement. So I think that's what's worth debating. Getting services with our agents that provide them buyer agency services to see all of the homes listed by our colleagues in the market is good for the consumer. We need them to have access to tools so that we can do CMAs, so that we can compare properties, so we can give them information about how to buy a house. It's literally half of the whole market. They're sellers and buyers. It's very binary. So I am concerned with some of the arguments leading me to a place where now we're going to be handicapped providing buyer agency services to people and not having great technology tools available to us because we've restricted it in such a way that that's no longer possible. But I think what's best for the consumer would be our agents having the most data, the most tools, and the most services to be able to provide as they're out looking for homes for sale. And of course, the listing brokerage should have the attribute. They should absolutely have it. I could care less about debating that point. I get concerned about the long tail of what are the consequences if those are the reasons that we're pushing it that way.
Thanks.
Thank you for your time.
All right, I can feel Sam wrapping it up, but the online folks are still angry.
What
Not
are
really
they angry about?
I got a couple of very basic questions. What happens if you're not in compliance? And what if you are a FSBO or a licensed agent that is not part of NAR?
So not in compliance with what would be the first question? If they're
In compliance with the policy, like what happens?
You mean the attribution policy particularly?
NAR policy in general?
Well,
MLSs can jeopardize their errors and omissions insurance coverage through NAR. And if it's a really egregious violation, where they're snubbing their nose at the industry and what we see as important, it could affect the association's charter.
Okay. And obviously, if you can't mandate beyond NAR, right? Like for FSBOs and people like Northwest MLS.
Northwest MLS. So there are independent multiple listing services out there that are not owned and operated by associations of realtors. They're not governed by NAR policies. That said, most realtor or most independent MLSs replicate the same policies that the National Association puts forward because they're vetted. It's defensible business operations. There might be some things here and there that you tweak and do something different. It seems that the National Association is kind of following the lead of some of the independents with regard to policies like clear cooperation. MRED was doing it years ago, displaying cooperating buyer broker compensation. Northwest MLS has been doing it for years. So they're not governed by NAR policy, but we all we operate under the same rules, regulations for the most part.
Thank you, live stream folks. Thank you, Greg Sachs, for reminding us that those questions are there. They volunteered to take these slings and arrows, so please thank them for coming here with us today. So next up, we're going to just keep going. We're not breaking officially. If you need to break on your own, great. But Rick Herrera is going to come up with Constellation 1. Again, we can talk about policy if that's what you want to continue talking about. Obviously, Rick is our subject matter expert when we really get into data aggregation and what data consumers need in this space, working with brokers. So again, informal. Please do jump up, grab a mic, come find us. We'll walk around. Let's just keep it going. Oh, reading the antitrust policy is a great idea. We're doing that again. Okay. Reso strives to create competition in the marketplace and will not be a forum for anti-competitive conduct. This is the 9th time you've heard that during our sessions, and we appreciate you sitting through it. You can talk to our counsel if you have any questions about our antitrust policy. Rick?
Well, that's certainly something to follow right there. I guess at this point, so a lot of talk's been about policy. That's great. It's been a great conversation. I've been in the industry for 20-some years, started doing screen scraping in 1999 at Realtor.com. RETS became a thing. I thought this was going to solve it all. I joined, became part of Data Dictionary to help solve these problems that we're talking about. We've made tremendous progress along the way. But I accepted this role to be data consumers, talk about pain points, because I feel like this is our opportunity to give back. This is how we give back to the industry that's given so much and that I'm part of. And so I ask for you guys to come up, ask your questions, be forward. This is your chance to give back. We want to know what the challenges are. We want to know what the problems are. Some of the things, the resolution, some areas where we've had direct changes because of these sessions have already been mentioned. So let's just open up the floor. Let's keep going.
I know Al and Dan, you guys had a lot of stuff if you want to start us off here. I'm just going to name names if people don't stand up, but I mean, we already started on the database. What does that cost? Folks are asking you to make a plan. What does that cost to even start making a plan with an MLS? That's literally why they're here asking these questions.
Well, I think the uncertainty around that makes that almost impossible to answer. That's the first problem. I think it goes without saying that the level of effort around even planning varies wildly, whether it's is standardization at egress sufficient? Does it have to include input forms, search, or does it have to be all the way down to the metal? The reality is across all matrix systems, even doing that planning at a deep level is thousands and thousands of hours, maybe tens of thousands of hours.
And are you talking about just from the input level? So forget the D word that we're not going to mention anymore. But
yeah, I can't. My former boss warned me a lot about saying numbers out loud, so I'm not going to. But it's big. Even to think about the work it would take to overhaul input to make that standardized, even if you were leaving the database layer alone, that's still big. So yeah, I don't think I can answer. It's a question we have too, and I think that we need to come to some understanding of the meaning of the word native before we can even reasonably talk about that. The other thing that I would have said while the three gentlemen were up there is the question about requiring, I can't even, it blew me away so much I don't quite have the details in my head anymore, but full-size photos, right? That's a super answerable question. And as the product manager for Trestle, or whatever it's called this week, thank you. I'm who that question would come to, and it has not. So the fact that a policy that really would have helped brokers got punted because you didn't know an answer is a bummer for me. I'm going to give you my card. I got it. Fair enough. No, look, I mean, and I'm sure, I get that. It's just...
It's literally punted so we could get answers here, Dan.
Yeah.
So that we wouldn't make decisions at NAR without talking to the technology community. Sorry, voice of God.
That really was.
So, I'm trying to find Bill Boyer around here. Where'd he go?
So what is the answer? You said that's a super simple question to answer.
No. I said it's answerable. I don't have the answer now, but it's very answerable. I got to do some research, but it's super answerable. I can get you that. In fact, we're working toward it. So, I got it. So, yeah, so listen, I heard that as like a simple thing you could have just reached out about, and I get it was more complicated than that, but I do want you to have a channel to us because we're the ones who can answer that.
So Bill's going to go, and then Steve?
Can I just give a stupid answer to this real quick? My answer is, dude, you gave us the photos. You're the one that gave them to us, and we have to give them back to you? Even worse, I have to pay CoreLogic to store all your original photos and then give them back to you? I don't want to store all those. I don't want to pay for that. You gave them to us in the first place. That's just my really silly answer.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
Thanks.
So, oh God. This is Bill Boyer with Commissions Inc. And I've been in many of the pain point sessions. I keep on repeating myself with a lot of the issues. Customized fields, web API, every vendor I deal with, it is different. And I think one of the things we need to look at doing is getting the couple providers we have of the different web APIs together and just have them hash out certain challenges that we have so we can get them resolved. I don't want to wait another 2 or 3 years for us to make it all the way through Reso standards and approved, which I'm hoping if these guys can just get together in a smaller group and hash some of these things out, such as a standard way of doing custom fields, a standard way of replicating data, that we can actually try to overcome these things a little bit faster.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I think it's something that we definitely could consider doing offline and having specified forums and inviting all the major vendors. Most have always been here in some fashion or another. We talked a little bit last night about the de facto standard. When all the vendors, there's a half a dozen major vendors, when they're all providing the same service in the same way, you have a de facto, so you have a standard in a sense. I will say that the work that Josh has done over the past couple of days, you've seen various versions of the certification tests that are out there. It's right on the cusp, and a ton of work has been done that I think is going to go a long way in just clarifying and really showing where data is truly compliant, where people are meeting the specification for transport, where they're meeting it at the data dictionary level, specifically how many fields are Reso compliant, how many fields are local, or not compliant, and having that out there, I think it's going to go a long way to say, okay, this is our gap. This is what we've got to fix. And I think having that data in the system, which requires people applying, getting certification, having that data in the systems allow us to focus on a real, measurable, factual issue. It's no longer opinions. It's no longer I had this one bad experience. It's here's the data. And to me, that's when we can really solve things. I think that's a tremendous idea. But I totally agree with you. I would probably say I'd like to see some of the certification results come in and actually see how far some of these gaps are, because I think that would go a long way as well.
Yeah, one of the problems with the certification is it still doesn't go over the ability of truly replicating yet, a consistent way of that. It does do great with the data dictionary and that field coverage, but the acquisition of me having to do if codes this vendor, if code that vendor is never a good thing.
Yeah, Josh has tried. So some of it is done. Certainly we're never perfect, and there's always going to be iterative improvements. There are 40 queries that we're testing against, and standard replication is part of the certification process, the new certification process. So pulling the initial 10,000 set of records, repulling data, matching metadata to property records, all of that is part of the new test, and he gets to retest. So if it just suddenly changes, you get to retest. So there's a lot of leeway there. I think we're going to get a lot of good insight. It's just we're like right at the cusp of it. And you guys saw some demos. Again, it's Sam, it should be out this year. Is that a commitment? And that's going to go a long way.
So I was actually walking to get coffee, and then I heard the photo comment, so I had to pipe back in here. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to say if any MLS person or MLS software vendor is in this room and wants to talk about how the brokerages actually get data into their systems, I am more than happy any time to have that conversation. So please feel free to reach out, eric@tribus.com. However, let me explain that photo comment. I think in MLSs, there's this concept like everything goes to one person at the brokerage, and then that brokerage puts all the photos in, and that one person or maybe a small team of individuals at the brokerage, like they have all of this data. And that's just not how it works, okay? So if you run a brokerage and you have more, first of all, if you run a small brokerage, chances are you do not have one person entering. The agents all enter the data into the MLS and into the systems themselves. If you are a medium-sized brokerage, you may do that on their behalf. But when you get to a large brokerage, chances are you don't do that again, or it's office staff people, assistants, things like that that are entering the data into the system. So what happens is you have this person over here entering the data, and this person, or you have the photographer that, some MLSs allow direct access for the photographers to log in and put in the photos. I can tell you from our clients, and we focus on the Realty Alliance style brokerage, the largest brokerage in markets. And I can tell you, nearly none of them have some sort of central repository of photos. I have 3 or 4 brokerages with over 2,000 people, and I asked them the question of where your photos are, and they said, the agents have them, the photographers have them. And so as a vendor, you guys, the MLSs, you guys are that central repository that one broker, a big broker, can go to and say, I have all of my stuff in one place. And then they can go and get those photos. So when I make that request, when I say that, it is coming from these brokers that are saying they want this. They just don't have that data. And it's the same thing with many other processes that I have talked to MLS, I've talked to many of you in this room, and there are assumptions about how processes inside of brokerages work that just aren't accurate.
right? Because, right, there are use cases that are allowed where you might utilize a photo in print of another broker's listings, right? So what's our case here? Because if the argument is that the broker already has the photos, well, one, we've got an argument against that already, but if the use case is you know, the full under IDX type of use, then, and I use IDX loosely as any reciprocal display or print or whatever, no, they don't have access. And I think we should also hear from some MLSs what they think about having their watermark taken off.
Anybody want to respond to that?
I'll just second that. I think we should be responsible for website level resolution photos, or maybe something in a flyer or something like that. I don't think we should be the ones to have to be the central storage location for high res marketing type photos for any brokerage.
I mean, it sounds to me like a service level item. You know, we've certainly in past sessions had people up here that described, we do luxury real estate, and if you're providing us the data, we'd like to see those super high res photos because it's luxury real estate. This is what people expect. People spend enormous amounts of money to build, you know, really smooth, fancy websites, and then have, you know, some 800 by 600 photo just doesn't cut it. It just doesn't work. You know, on the data side, having been on the data side, I spent a lot of time at Realtor.com with Constellation One. We're providing photos out. It's really easy to downsize for me, but I really can't upsize without losing something. So as a requester of data, if I wear many hats, and if I put that hat on, I'm always going to want the highest resolution when possible. I know at Constellation, our policy is we store the original photo, and then we can, you know, on the APIs in the fly, you can actually just downsize it if you want to. But we always store the original we receive, and it's important. Some people want that.
Also, what's the definition of a website photo, right? I mean, it changes all the time. You remember a few years ago, Mac came out and had the high DPI screens, and now almost everything has that. If you would have asked that question a few years ago, I guarantee you most people in the room would have said 72 DPI photo at 640 by 480. And now, you know, obviously people chuckle at that, but we're talking screens that are over 200 pixels now, and we're talking, you know, when you display something on a website, you're talking an 8K monitor. I literally get broker customers. I had a broker customer in Boston, and they were flabbergasted that when we built them this absolutely beautiful website that was near full screen photos for their individual listings, that the listing photo we got from the MLS was not, it did not fill the screen. And I had to go back and forth with them to explain. They said, well, our photographers uploaded the photo. Why can't we get that photo that we did? And I said, well, that's not how we're getting the data from the MLS, and explain this process. And when the photo gets uploaded, your databases all have that photo. Now, whether you delete it afterwards, right, that's a different question. But it had to have gotten uploaded to the MLS system before it gets put into a thumbnail, into your highest res image, whatever it happens to be. You have it for a brief fleeting moment, if nothing else. So again, the one main value that an MLS provides to a broker, to me, is it is a central repository of all their listings. If you ask brokers the question of, you know, what listings do you have right now, the system that they go to answer that question, especially when it's not 3 listings that they can manage on a whiteboard, if it's a brokerage with 2,000 listings, they're logging into your systems and saying, oh, well, we've got 1,200 listings right now, and our average price point is this, and it's this, and it's this. They're using your systems to answer those questions about their business overall.
If I can just switch topics a bit, I feel we're making really good progress in the certification work group and certification subcommittee to get all the Reso fields, you know, fully input and output correctly. We're validating them all. We're tracking them all now. We're going to know a lot of information about who's filling in what fields and who is really following the standard, right? So maybe one of the things we've got to do with that policy is maybe not say that it's internal. It changed their input forms. Maybe we need to focus more on the RETs, oh, sorry, not RETs, the web API. Ooh, I can't believe I said that. focus on the web API outputting the right fields. I think that's far more important than making sure that everyone's changing their, and I'm not going to say database because you're never going to change your database, but you're changing your, if you change the fields that you're outputting with your web APIs and your, the other thing, it's going to be a lot of work. Whereas if you still allow the secondary systems to be out there and outputting the correct field names in the Reso standard, I think that is going to suffice and going to satisfy the requirement of getting all the data in the right way to everybody, right? And just another point on the compatibility issues and the way people are doing things. I mean, we're definitely working on that hard. We even added a new data consumer subgroup, right? If you recall, so I would definitely join that one. We're going to take everything that comes in from the data consumer subgroup and make sure that we take those concerns back and figure out how to, with certification, come up with the right way to do that.
Sorry, just one more thing really quick want to add. Maybe I missed a lot of discussion earlier, just coming late, but on the image part, because we've been doing a lot of AI, we put together many patterns, but on the image part, I think it would be good for the industry to have some standards as to the level of resolution on each image posted, and also the lighting condition, because a lot of agents, when we see that the image quality is so poor, even if whatever how big volume you posted, if the image quality is poor, it's not only bad for the listing effects, and also it's bad for for the system later. Even you store it for many years, you're trying to pull it out to look at it later, you couldn't be of any usage. And from the AI perspective, if you want to, because we have a lot of technology to detect, but if the resolution is too low or lighting is not good, you might give, we can say, we can pretty much, still give a good result, but I know some other, like vendors or some other providers, they might point out that this resolution is bad or whatever. So I think as an industry, we need to have a good standards as to each image that the agent posted. So maybe have certain range, say, within the at least 20 images, you need to have at least certain standards. So, it's good for everyone later down the road. Thanks.
So Al McKelman again from CoreLogic. I think this is a pain point that's not going to be very popular. So I'm expecting a few groans here, but I think one of the things that came across as we started doing the new tool and the new certification tools, it is now no longer possible to certify data dictionary on RETs. So we talked earlier about doing all these native conversions for some systems who might not even have web API access today. 5 years ago, we separated web API certification from data dictionary certification, and you might as well combine them again because you cannot certify on RETs any longer.
Yeah, I think that was very intentional. We are trying to move forward. I mean, I think it almost points to the bigger problem, though, which is why is there still so much RETs out there? I know one of the conversations that we have regularly, and we want to get addressed out here as part of pain points, is if you're not already at a point where you're getting close to certification for Reso Web API and the data dictionary, what's holding you back? What is the real roadblock? Because that to me is $1 million question I wish we had the answer to, is so we could help guide that and help ease some of those burdens and some of those issues. I don't know, I won't speak for Sam. The idea of going back, I don't think we're going there. I just don't see that happening. I don't think it's realistic. But it's more of how do we move forward is the way I see it. But it's an opinion.
I think it's a little more complicated than that because like when you have a customer who is not native or not native compliant, so most of the CoreLogic customers use the aggregator, they are fully compliant for data dictionary in both RETs and Web API. But if they want their native system to be compliant without Web API, they don't have that option.
It's your organization. We made a decision at the end of 2018 to only certify on Web API, data dictionary across Web API. We do have the capability of doing, in the future, DD-JSON certifications. We can do this in a non-web API environment. Your member organizations here thought that to push forward web API, that's how we should certify going forward. We can do both. So that's why we have these sessions. If we want to be able to do it simultaneously on a native system that's not across the web API, we could do that as well. And so that's what we should be doing in our transport meetings, in our certification meetings, talking about different ways of doing that. And you all know we'll end up talking about business practices here a lot of times, and the standards work groups will decide that line between minimum standard requirements and individual decisions that businesses are going to make. But that's a good conversation for us to have. Do we need to do multiple kinds of certifications in the future? One other thing we should talk about, because Bill started it, but we didn't get too deep into it, and this is that business practices question again. Replication. It's still the 90% business case. So while we know there are companies using live queries, running websites directly off web API, do we need more diving into standardizing of that? You're all here. All the companies who do the aggregation and distribution for brokers are all here. Are there things we need to sort of normalize around for data consumers to make that easier? You'd be a good person to talk about what you think.
Sure. I would say we've come a long way. It is starting to get a little bit better, but there are still challenges. You know, the same conversation we've had before, as far as when I speak to each vendor, each one has its own set of differences. Modification timestamp, a very tough field to work through. Is it the MLS system timestamp? We still get lots of records where a timestamp changed, and the records are exactly the same when you put a hash on them. So then I have to make a decision as I'm pushing data out. Do I want to change my timestamp so that they don't have to bother getting a record that doesn't matter? There are still issues and things like that that we still do face, but I'd love to hear from others as far as what are some of the challenges that you get. As Sam said, 90% of us are doing replication. Any thoughts, comments? Did we solve this problem already?
Yeah, got to press up. Yeah. Dan, again, CoreLogic. I'm quite open to that conversation. I know that there have some things have been coming to me that I know are pain points across our platforms, and I'm super eager to talk about that, for the record.
Yeah, I thought Bill's idea of actually getting the vendors together and actually really talking about some of these challenges as a group was a great idea. That's something we need to put together. Could go a long way, actually.
Another one of the pain points we have is throttling. You know, a couple of the providers do have throttles. I understand why they have it, because we definitely, not all of us consumers behave nicely sometimes. And it's kind of sometimes hard to work around these throttles, because we deal with a trestle, which every time we add a new trestle, they bump the throttle up, and that works out pretty well. And I know some of them are playing around with it, but we do hit these limits, or at certain times of the day we're getting more stuff, so we're hitting them. We do hit the limits and get shut down a little bit. Luckily, again, we only have a number of providers. They have been playing nicely with that, but I know other people have had those challenges too.
Sam, was your question, do we want to spend more focus on trying to make live query more of a robust solution? Was that the?
Consumers, is it really, some folks we hear, it's just really, really different across platforms. And maybe that's just business practices and it is the way it's going to be. But then some folks say it's really, really hard because of the different idiosyncrasies of systems. Yeah. Is that a common occurrence?
Well,
You would
I
probably
think,
know.
I may have a different opinion than some folks, but I guess having done this for a while, we're quickly moving in the right direction of making it making it easier to consume data. And if we have 5 or 6 different flavors of Reso Web API, that's a lot better than 500 different RET servers. And I guess maybe I'm just more of an incrementalist, but to me that's enough. regarding the live queries for the web API, I just don't see that as being ever being more than an edge case in the industry. Or at least it just seems like there are too many other dependencies to make that something that would be attractive to a vendor or something that would be supportable by an MLS vendor.
I know one area I've been talking about internally at Constellation is, the model of pulling data to me is, and to I'm sure many here, is just so outdated. Today we have to query an MLS server, hit a vendor and say, hey, every 5 minutes, every 2 minutes, if it's a big market, every 1 minute, has anything changed? Has anything changed? Has anything changed? Usually it's no, but it's traffic, it's noise. If you're running serverless in AWS, it costs you money every time you do it. That's not free. And there's a lot of technology solutions out there today as far as topics and subscribing to topics and getting notified when a change happens. And so one of the things we were talking about, and I've spoken a little bit to Josh, is it worth running a test of saying, hey, we will go ahead and switch over and we'll notify our clients if something changed. We'll actually take care of that process. There's many technologies today, Kafka, Kinesis, that take care of this process for you, that are way more efficient, they're restful, they're easy to work with. But it's one of those interesting scenarios when we're not fully certified and we haven't already done what we set out to do, but because it's taken so long, technology does not stay the same. Technology advances, and it advances fast. Is it crazy to start doing something else? But at Constellation, we are going to try to do this in the next couple months. We are going to put it out there and see if we can find a partner or two that's willing to work with us and try this and just notify you. If anything's changed, here it is, come get it. And that's close to real time as opposed to having to ping us every 15 minutes to see if something changed. So we'll get you data faster and better.
I think it was Cass back there that was mentioning being incrementalist, which I think to that point and to the throttling mentioned earlier, right? Why are you doing that? And one, we've got a diversity of how people are throttling, but then there's also the reason why you're throttling and the behaviors. So somebody repulling the entire database just continuously over and over and over and over, right? So you've got a certain throttle that catches that type of a thing. People that are forming bad queries, people that are grabbing stuff, based on timestamps versus maybe cycling through a queue of keys versus, right? So I think there are a lot of little things that can be gone after, and there's a lot of practices that are already in place that are successful, both on the best practice and then how to stop people who aren't doing best practices. Because I know from my standpoint, having gone out and gotten data from different places, if I had some expectations of what some of the throttling rules or some of those things were, and maybe even some expectation that I wouldn't have some kind of crazy, overly suppressive throttling, it would help. It would save time. I think it would be one of those incremental things that helps with the overall picture of replication until maybe, I see replication as never going away, and that, out on the distant horizon, we're going to wind up with a better method, whether it's leveraging OData or whether it's a whole nother technology, that we will take a next step, but we do need to do things in the meantime.
Yeah, we have talked a little bit internally about trying to create, a best practice guide or some thoughts around throttling. It is a challenge, and it's different for each company we work with. Sometimes it's on your entire account, so we could have 100 accounts, but we have one limit for everything. And so if one feed goes bad, it actually blows for all the other feeds too. And now everybody else is affected because one MLS had a bad update, updated it, marked everything with an update timestamp, blew our throttle, blew our limits, our quotas, and now the other 99 MLSs we can't get data on. So there are things we could probably do if we wanted to have some side conversations, or how do we go through and create more standards around that is probably a really good practice.
You heard NAR talking earlier about making sure data access is on an MLS's website. Just objective parts of the information as to how to do that. Do we need to categorize certain things so that data aggregation companies and MLSs can show their data consumer companies exactly what those categories of issues or business rules are in place for throttling, whatever else it happens to be. So it's not just a you find out when you try to work with this vendor, and we can more clearly and objectively explain that to the companies who are data consumer companies. Okay, thanks.
And it's important, and to put on top of that, I understand the need for it, because we pull in data from 500 plus MLSs, but we're also providing data out to our customers, and so we have to have throttles in the APIs that we have as well. So it's necessary. It's not a bad thing. Again, it's just what are some common best practices so that it's efficient and so that it's reasonable in the way it's being done.
Okay. Just people should take a look at RCP 27 and 28, because 27 I think is the new log-based replication resource that we were proposing, and 28 is webhooks on top of that. So I think we have a start on getting there. We just haven't really pushed those through and haven't really worked on those. So we should probably start working on those by the sounds of it, since people are more interested in getting a more real-time replication feed.
Yeah, I hadn't really considered Sam's idea about having the restrictions and the requirements in place for data consumers to be more transparent and available to everyone. I think that's a great idea, because I do think there's an air of mystery about some of that. That said, I mean, a lot of it can be handled with conversations and explaining, pleading your case to the vendor. But I do think it would help the brokers, especially, to understand what restrictions are in place just in general. I think when Tribus was talking about the image problems, I mean, I think that's sort of a similar thing. I don't think it's well understood among brokerages what limitations are put in place and why they're in place, and so that might help too.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a very specific topic. So capturing the limitations that people are facing and how to capture that, because from that comes the opportunity to discuss, flesh out and potentially try to solve. So I think that's a good point.
So I got another challenge, is data shares. You have a lot of MLSs, let's say California, and every one of them are sharing data with each other. And I have to pull down an IDX, and I'm constantly pulling the same listings down. One example of a throttle is one of the MLSs provides the URL, and they throttle because we want to download the image, they actually will block you from hitting their image URL if you're doing too much hitting on that. And I'm doing it 3 times over again because I have it through data shares.
Okay.
It would be amazing if there was a UPI and a ULI and a UOI on every listing, right? And you could just pull it once.
And you could query on it?
Sergio mentioned, I know it's a little in the weeds with the transport work, but we're also really documenting who's implemented these standards, RCP 27 and 28. I think some of your companies are using them in the background. You don't have to tell us about it today, but we want those to be on the work group pages so we can see which companies have used them. It's good for marketing, but it's also good for us as staff and as the board to be able to say this is things we're moving forward towards ratification and more communication. So if any of you want to grab a microphone and tell us you're already using it in your systems, I know some of you are, but it's okay if you're not able to talk about that today.
All right. One issue I think that when it comes to like ingesting photos in particular, which is pretty much all we do, is like a universal identifier would be great, but a lot of the times people will, or the images that are posted, are going to be named like 1 through 11, and if something goes down or you change the order of it, it's still 1 through 11, but now the 3 images have changed. And media keys don't always change in the Reso standard. I mean, this has kind of been solved for a long time. It's always been odd to us. Why don't we just have like a SHA hash of every single image on like the media key field resource in general? Because that just solves a lot of this. I have to download this image every time, and now we're getting throttled on the CDN. And it tells you if the image has actually changed or not, or if it's now named something else.
Yeah, that is certainly one potential technical solution to the problem. I think there's probably several others as well.
You
It
said
is something. It is
Shaw
certainly
hash, and
something. I think that's perfect for a work group discussion because it's how to create best practices and the common way to do things, and whether or not we want to get into a specific technology is an interesting piece there.
Yeah, you said Shaw hash, and I was checking for Josh on Slack because I thought for sure he'd be all over that right now, but not yet.
Or am I live? I'm live. Great. So a couple of comments going back to throttling, and one for the photos also. On the throttling and just serving photos and stuff, the one thing we're not talking about, and I know we're in a technical discussion, is the cost, right? I mean, as a vendor storing these photos, supplying that data, you know, if you're hitting my database and asking for every listing every day, there's a cost to that. And folks are reluctant to go to a usage-based pay model. I mean, that's a really tough discussion to have with your customer and for that customer to have with their brokers. But that's really what it comes down to. It's not that I want to throttle you, but you're pulling so much resources that it's affecting my infrastructure. And if my infrastructure cost goes up by double, somebody's got to pay for that. All right? It's not free. Thinking about the photo discussion, I mean, I know in my system, we made the decision, whatever image we get, that's the one we store. We store one image, right? And like I think you mentioned, Rick, like we resize on the fly, right? If you wanted a thumbnail, I'm going to give you a thumbnail. I'll have the high resolution back there, and I can certainly feed it to my brokers in the market. It's not a problem. I don't know if that solves that kind of like, you know, so then like, well, what's the Shaw hash of that photo? Is it my high res or is it another? But I would also say that, you know, my media resource will reflect whether or not those photos changed. And maybe that's an implementation detail because I don't allow somebody to replace a photo on a listing. You know, if they can delete one, but when they give me another photo, maybe it's the new frontal photo, it's not going to have the same ID number in my media resource.
Yeah, and that varies by provider.
Sure.
I will speak from experience.
That
is not always the case.
It's not. I mean,
appreciate that.
I remember years back having the same discussion, right? I mean, like we were back in the dinosaur days of RETs, you know, and like, well, 0 was or I even forget now, right? It's like, but we couldn't figure out which one was the main. If you could either get all the photos or you could get the main photo. But if you got all the photos, you didn't know which one was the main photo. So you had to request it twice.
And we now have is primary option in the standard.
Right.
So it's not necessarily just 0. But I will say I don't see that populated very often. It's normally still, we default to the 0. We check here, but it's pretty much always still defaults to the 0.
I think you did it, Rick. I think we're all good. Remember, Rick is chairing our data consumers group, subgroup of transport right now. So we'll collect these notes, bring them up in that group particularly, and be able to continue this discussion. So if you haven't signed up for that group, we'd love to get you involved, info@reso.org. Give a big hand to our friend Rick Herrera for leading this today. Thank you. So a final thank you to everyone on the live stream. We appreciate you coming with us, even though you didn't get to the receptions. We want to see you out at the next event. Again, the bundle's open for the 2 conferences next year, so you can go to reso.org and register. Thank you all. It was a lot of fun, and we'll see you next time.